Every Wednesday at 10 a.m., an old man sits beside a grave. But what if I told you the story isn't about death, but about how a stranger's note saved his life in a world where grief often goes unnoticed? One silent connection sparked a bond stronger than blood. This isn't just about loss, it's about the quiet power of being seen. Stay with us, because what happens next might just restore your faith in humanity. Before we dive into this moving story of love, loss, and unexpected connection, let us know where you're watching from. Let's get started. Every Wednesday at exactly 10 a.m., Henry made his quiet pilgrimage to the same spot in Willow Glen Cemetery, nestled beneath a leaning pine tree whose twisted roots clung to the soil like aged fingers unwilling to let go. With the help of his weathered cane, he unfolded an old wooden chair, set it near the gravestone, and placed fresh lilies in a tin vase. Then he'd sit, shoulders hunched, whispering into the morning breeze, not loud enough for anyone to hear, but just enough to keep the silence company. Locals had noticed him. Of course, the elderly man in the brown overcoat with hands that trembled just a little more each week. Most assumed he was visiting a late spouse, perhaps mourning a decades-long love story faded by time. But no one truly knew who was buried there. No one asked. Henry never missed a Wednesday. Not for snow, not for storms. He came like clockwork, rain or shine, his presence a fixture in that quiet corner of the cemetery. And though no one approached him, those who passed by felt the weight of something sacred, a grief so deep. It carved silence into the air around him like a prayer left unfinished. One gray Wednesday in early November, the wind carried a sharper chill than usual as Henry made his way through the gravel path of Willow Glen. The skies hinted at rain, and the clouds hung low like heavy thoughts. Still, he came as always. But something was different that morning. As he approached the headstone, the one carved with both his wife's name, Margaret, and their son, Caleb, a fallen Marine, he saw something unusual tucked neatly into the top corner of the stone, a small, folded note held in place by a smooth pebble. Henry's breath caught in his throat. His trembling hands reached for the paper. Unfolding it slowly, he found words written in a gentle, looping script. "I've seen you here. Every week. Your love is visible. Your grief matters. You're not alone." He stood still for several minutes, holding the note as if it might vanish. His eyes welled up, and for the first time in years, the tears didn't come from pain alone. They came from being seen. The next week, there was another note. "I lost someone too. I come here for the same reason you do. Maybe one day, we could sit together even in silence." Henry read that second message 5 times, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat pocket. It warmed him more than the scarf around his neck. He didn't know who the writer was, man or woman, young or old. But he began looking forward to those Wednesdays in a different way, not just to speak to his family, but to read what the mysterious soul would say next. Every message felt like a thread, stitching something gently back together inside him. Week after week, the notes kept coming. They were simple, honest. Sometimes they contained memories, sometimes just quotes, but always understanding. A shared pain written in ink. Henry, once a fortress of silence, had started to open up in return. Eventually, he left a note of his own, resting it by the vase of flowers. "To whoever you are, thank you. You've made this bench feel less cold." And with that, an invisible bridge had been built, 2 strangers connected not by introductions, but by loss. Henry no longer felt like he was simply surviving the days. He felt accompanied, understood. For the first time in 2 decades, he felt the quiet begin to shift like the thawing of winter ground, and all it had taken was a folded piece of paper and a few brave words from someone who cared enough to notice a lonely man at a lonely grave. On a crisp winter morning, just as frost painted silver edges on every leaf in Willow Glen, Henry walked his familiar path, a bouquet of white camellias in hand. He'd grown used to the ritual arrive. Sit, speak, read. The notes had continued each week, each one deepening the quiet companionship he felt with his unseen friend. But that day, there was no note. Instead, someone was already sitting on the bench next to his. She was young, maybe late 20s. Her red scarf stood out vividly against the pale sky. She wore a thick wool coat and held her gloved hands around a steaming cup of coffee. Her gaze wasn't on him, nor the gravestones. It was fixed on the ground, like she was searching for the right words hidden in the dirt. Henry hesitated. The unspoken rule of the cemetery: solitude. Respect. Distance was suddenly broken. But as he stepped closer to his family's grave, she lifted her eyes and gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "I hope this isn't strange," she said gently. "I'm Emily. I've been the one leaving the notes." Henry stopped, the air catching in his chest. He hadn't prepared for this. Not really. He had imagined who the writer could be: a fellow veteran, perhaps an older widow, not a young woman with grief in her eyes that mirrored his own. "I've seen you here for years," she continued. "My mom is buried a few rows over. She passed last winter. I didn't know how to talk about it, but I saw you. And somehow, it made me feel less alone." Henry sat slowly, staring at the gravestone, then back at her. The silence that hung between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. Shared. "I never thought anyone noticed," he said softly. "I did," she replied. "Every week." They didn't talk much more that day. There was no need to. They just sat, letting the cold air move around them, letting the moment settle like snow. And in that stillness, something unspoken passed between them, not quite friendship yet, not quite family, just the understanding of two people who carried loss like a second skin and found in one another a small pocket of peace. Emily placed a single sunflower on the edge of Henry's bench before she left. "For Margaret," she said, "and Caleb." As she walked away, Henry's eyes stayed on the sunflower, bright against the gray stone. That morning changed everything, because the moment Emily sat down, the years of quiet grief cracked just enough to let light in. Not by force, not by intention, but simply by presence. Sometimes, the most unexpected encounter can feel like the answer to a prayer you never dared to speak aloud. The weeks that followed that first encounter didn't unfold like a movie or a sudden miracle. They moved slowly, like winter turning to spring, barely noticeable at first, yet undeniably changing everything. Henry and Emily began to meet more often, not by planning, but by rhythm, two hearts beating in sync with grief and routine. Some days they spoke, other days they didn't. But always, they sat side by side, their silences no longer lonely, just full. Henry found himself noticing things again: the birds rustling in the branches above Margaret's grave, the way sunlight hit the headstone at just the right angle in late afternoon, even the crispness of the winter air that once felt like punishment but now carried promise. For decades, he had carried grief like armor, something that weighed him down but protected him from being wounded again. He believed the world had moved on without him, that his chapter had ended when he lost his family. But sitting beside Emily, someone younger, yet just as hollowed out by loss, he began to realize something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. He still mattered. One Wednesday, as they walked slowly toward the cemetery gate, Emily turned and asked, Do you ever feel guilty for laughing?" Henry looked at her, surprised. "All the time," he admitted. "I laughed yesterday," she whispered, eyes glassy, "at something silly on the radio. And then I cried, because I felt like I betrayed her." Henry nodded slowly. "After Caleb died, I didn't smile for 6 years. Thought if I did, it meant I was letting go. And that felt wrong." And now Emily asked, "Now I think, remembering with joy is still remembering," he said. "They wouldn't want us to live inside the pain forever." It was a simple sentence, but for Emily, it shifted something deep. They began meeting outside the cemetery for coffee at a small diner down the street, for walks in the park nearby. She helped Henry carry groceries. He taught her how to play chess. They became part of each other's lives, not to replace what was lost, but to honor it by continuing forward. Henry's world, once reduced to granite and flowers, began to expand. He found himself humming again, reading poetry he used to love, even writing letters to an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years. He wasn't healed, grief didn't vanish, but the sharp edges had softened, and Emily, too, found a quiet strength in their bond. For the first time since her mother passed, she looked ahead without dread. They were no longer two strangers beside adjacent graves. They were two survivors tethered not by tragedy, but by the courage to feel again. Spring arrived earlier than expected in Willow Glen. The cemetery bloomed with colored daffodils lining the gravel paths, robins returning to their favorite branches. But the most unexpected bloom of all was Henry himself. One Thursday afternoon, breaking his usual routine, Henry stood inside the local town hall, speaking with quiet conviction to the clerk behind the counter. In his hand was a file old papers concerning the family burial plot he had owned for nearly 40 years. "I'd like to donate the last grave space," he said. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "To whom?" "To someone who doesn't have anyone," Henry replied. "A veteran, or maybe someone without a family, someone who shouldn't be forgotten." It had taken him weeks to come to the decision. That final plot had once symbolized where he'd rest beside Margaret and Caleb, but now, it no longer felt like a destination. Living had become more urgent than dying. That evening, he told Emily. She was quiet for a moment. "You're giving up your space next to them." Henry smiled. "I don't need to lie beside the dead anymore," he said gently. "I have someone to live for." Tears filled her eyes, and for once, she didn't hide them. This new chapter in Henry's life wasn't just about Emily. He began volunteering with a local grief support group, sharing his story with those who had lost children, spouses, siblings. He never tried to be a hero, just a voice in the dark, reassuring others they weren't alone. Emily encouraged him, even joined him sometimes. She had returned to school, studying to become a hospice nurse. Henry beamed with pride when she showed him her textbooks and nervously recited flashcards about medications and palliative care. "You'll be good at this," he told her one afternoon. "You've lived it. People will feel safe with you." And for the first time since her mother's passing, Emily believed him. One Saturday, Henry invited Emily to visit a bench in the local park, the one where he had taken Margaret every Sunday morning when they were young. They sat together under a blooming cherry tree, sunlight dappling through the petals. "I used to think I had one love in my life," Henry said, "but now I think love has many shapes. Yours saved me." Emily reached for his hand, and they sat there, surrounded by life, by laughter of children nearby, by the scent of spring. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't meant to be. It was something richer, a bond forged in mourning and rebuilt through meaning. Henry had found a new opportunity not to replace what was lost, but to honor it by helping someone else carry the weight. And Emily? She had found a father figure she never expected, someone who reminded her that healing doesn't mean forgetting, but choosing to remember with hope. By the time summer arrived, Henry had become a familiar face not just at the cemetery, but across the town of Willow Glen. The man once known only as the quiet visitor by the crooked tree was now someone people waved to at the farmer's market. Someone the librarian saved books for. Someone the neighborhood kids occasionally helped with his groceries, mostly for his stories, which they claimed were better than TikTok. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't visible to most. It was in the way Henry woke up each morning, not just to fulfill a ritual, but with intent, with purpose. He had started journaling again, something he hadn't done since before Caleb was deployed. His entries weren't long, but they were honest, sometimes raw, sometimes reflective. On one page he wrote, "I thought healing would feel like forgetting. It doesn't. It feels like remembering without breaking." Emily noticed the change in him. The man who once walked with hunched shoulders now stood a little taller. His voice, once brittle and barely above a whisper, now carried stories. Laughter, even the occasional grumble about modern technology. He had embraced a kind of aging, not rooted in decline, but in rediscovery. One afternoon, Henry was invited to speak at a Memorial Day event at the local community center. It was small, just a gathering of families, veterans, and town residents. But for Henry, it was monumental. He stood at the podium, hands steady for the first time in years, and shared Caleb's story. He talked about his son's courage, yes, but also about his mischievous sense of humor, the way he burned every pancake he ever made, and how he used to call Margaret the boss with a grin. But the part that silenced the room was when Henry spoke of what came after the loss. "I didn't just lose my son," he said. "I lost the sound of my own voice. I lost my place in the world. But grief is a language too. And when someone learns to speak it with you, you stop being alone." He paused, glanced at Emily in the front row. "I met someone who sat with me in that silence not to fix me, but to witness me. And in doing that, she helped me remember who I was before the silence." After his speech, people lined up to thank him, veterans saluted, young widows hugged him. A boy no older than 12 asked if he could visit Caleb's grave. Henry smiled and said, "Of course. Tell him I sent you." Back at home, Henry placed a photograph on his mantle, not of the past, but of the present, him and Emily at the park bench under the cherry tree, laughing over ice cream. He no longer feared being forgotten, because now he was part of someone else's story, not as a shadow of grief, but as a beacon of what comes after. Autumn returned, and with it, a golden hush settled over Willow Glen. The trees turned to fire red, orange. Gold and leaves drifted across the cemetery like whispers from another world. Henry still visited the grave every Wednesday, but now he wasn't alone. Emily was almost always by his side. Sometimes they brought flowers, sometimes hot tea, but always they brought each other. One morning, as they sat beneath the now familiar pine, Henry took a deep breath and said, "You know, I used to think life ended when the people you loved died. But now I think it only ends when you stop letting yourself love again." Emily didn't respond with words. She simply reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an old note, yellowed and creased from time, the very first one she had left on the gravestone. "I never thought you'd find it," she said with a smile. "I was terrified." Henry chuckled softly. "I'm glad I did. That little piece of paper changed everything." They sat in thoughtful silence, watching the wind stir the leaves like memories dancing one last time before winter. Around them, the cemetery was still sacred, but no longer sorrowful. It had become a place of continuity, of connection, not just endings. That week, Henry did something he hadn't done in over 20 years. He sang. It was just a soft hum, barely carried by the breeze, But Emily recognized the tune, an old folk song Margaret used to love. She didn't interrupt. She simply listened, letting the melody wrap around them like a shared secret. Later that evening, as they walked past the church downtown, they saw a candlelight vigil being held in remembrance of lives lost. Without hesitation, they joined in, no longer bystanders to grief, but participants in healing. Henry held a candle, the light trembling in his hand. "Next to him," Emily whispered. "We're not alone, are we?" He shook his head. "We never were. We just forgot how to see each other." That night, Henry wrote one final entry in his journal. Love doesn't leave when a person dies. It waits, sometimes quietly, sometimes in the form of a stranger, sometimes folded in a note, but it waits for the chance to be found again. The story of Henry and Emily didn't make headlines. There was no viral post, no televised moment, but it didn't need one, because it became something even more powerful, a quiet legacy. They proved that even the smallest acts, a note, a seat on a bench, a moment of shared silence, can reignite the will to live. That healing is not forgetting, but remembering in a way that invites others in. And that even in a graveyard, life can begin again. Grief is not a journey with a clear end. It's a path we walk over and over, sometimes stumbling, sometimes pausing, sometimes walking it with someone new. Henry and Emily's story reminds us that healing doesn't always come from grand gestures. Often, it's the smallest acts of kindness, a handwritten note, a shared bench, a steady presence that begin to stitch the broken parts back together. Because love never really leaves, it just changes form. Take a moment this week to reach out to someone who might be grieving, not to fix them, but simply to sit with them. Leave a note, make a call, invite them for coffee. You don't need the perfect words. Your presence is enough. If you're the one grieving, know this healing isn't linear, and you're not alone. Join a support group. Write a letter to the one you lost. Say their name aloud. Even in silence, connection can bloom. Sometimes, just sitting beside someone in their sorrow can become the greatest act of love and the beginning of both your healing journeys. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to feel seen and heard. Leave a comment below. Who has ever sat quietly beside your pain? Like this video if you believe even the smallest act can save a soul. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt, healing stories like this one. And if you're carrying silent grief, write one line in the comments. You never know, someone, like Emily, might be there to sit with you.